September 1851, Ohio. A wedding day meant to be remembered for love, joy, and new beginnings, but it became one of the darkest chapters in American history. Guests laughed, music played, food was served, and then, one by one, people began to collapse in agony. What no one knew was that the cook, an enslaved woman forced into silence her entire life, had hidden a deadly secret inside the feast. Why did she do it? How did she plan it? And what happened when the truth came out? This isn't just the story of a poisoned wedding, it's the story of resistance, vengeance, and a chilling reminder of the power of the overlooked. Stay with me till the end, because once you hear how this tragedy unfolded, you'll never look at a wedding feast the same way again. And before we dive in, if you love dark, untold histories and real stories that schools never taught you, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the kind of stories that shake you to your core. In the autumn of 1851, the air in Ohio carried a crispness that promised change. On the morning of a long-awaited wedding, the countryside seemed to hum with anticipation. Families dressed in their finest clothes traveled by carriage and on foot, eager to attend what was expected to be one of the grandest celebrations in the county. The estate stood tall against the rolling fields, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the sunlight as ribbons and garlands swayed in the soft wind. The household had been preparing for days, and now every detail spoke of joy, wealth, and the promise of a bright future for the young couple at the heart of it all. The bride, draped in a gown of pale silk, was the picture of innocence and hope. Her cheeks flushed with excitement as relatives fussed over her hair and veil. The groom, proud and eager, greeted guests with a firm handshake and a smile that seemed almost unshakable. Together, they represented everything the community cherished: youth, prosperity, and the continuity of family legacies. Laughter echoed across the yard as children darted between adults, their shoes stirring up dust from the road. The scene seemed to belong to a painting of domestic bliss, unmarred by the harsher realities of life in a country torn between freedom and bondage. Inside the house, the kitchen roared with activity. Pots clattered, ovens smoked, and the heavy aroma of roasted meats and spiced pies filled the air. It was here, away from the sparkle of celebration, that the enslaved cook worked tirelessly, ensuring that every dish would leave the table as a masterpiece. Her hands moved with practiced speed, ladling stews, kneading dough, and seasoning with care born of long years in the kitchen. To the family and their guests, she was invisible, just another servant moving silently in the background, keeping the grand illusion of perfection alive. The dining tables stretched long and wide, covered with linen and decorated with flowers freshly cut from the garden. Crystal glasses reflected the light like tiny prisms, and silver cutlery gleamed beside porcelain plates. For the guests, it promised abundance and luxury, the kind of feast spoken of for years afterward. The sound of a fiddle tuned itself in the distance, preparing to play songs that would send skirts twirling and boots stomping well into the night. Every guest believed they were witnessing the beginning of a union blessed with happiness and plenty, yet beneath the carefully arranged beauty of the day lay an unease no one could name. The cook, unseen in her labor, carried a heaviness that no one could sense amid the laughter. To her, the glitter of ribbons and the clink of glasses were not symbols of joy but chains that reminded her of her station. She served the household not out of devotion or gratitude, but because she had no choice. And while the bride's future seemed filled with freedom and love, the cook's future promised nothing but more servitude, more silence, and more years of being forgotten in the shadows. The stage was set for celebration, but within the feast itself, a darker fate was already taking shape, one that would turn a day of joy into one of the most chilling tragedies the community would ever witness. While the guests mingled outside, bathed in sunlight and the sweet sound of fiddles, another world existed within the house, one of heat, sweat, and silence. The kitchen was the heart of that world, its fires burning hotter than the autumn sun, its air thick with the mingled scents of sugar, butter, and smoke. And at the center of it all was the woman who held more power than anyone realized, the enslaved cook. She had no name in the records that survived, No story told in her own voice, but her presence on that day was undeniable, and her influence would soon echo through every corner of the estate. Her life had been one of shadows. For years she had risen before dawn, her body aching before the work had even begun, and bent over stoves that never seemed to cool. The kitchen was her prison, though its walls were lined with jars of spices, sacks of flour, and barrels of salted meat. Each meal she prepared was a performance she never chose to give, crafted not for her family, but for the very people who claimed ownership of her existence. Their smiles over a well-baked pie or perfectly roasted fowl came at the cost of her exhaustion, yet within that servitude she had learned more than anyone suspected. She knew the temperaments of her enslavers, the weaknesses in their habits, the vulnerabilities in their routines. She knew what herbs could heal and which could harm. She knew that every celebration, every gathering, every feast they demanded of her depended entirely upon her labor, and that knowledge carried its own kind of power, a power she had never dared to wield. Until this day, as the wedding drew near, she was forced into preparing a banquet that represented everything denied to her. The bride would walk into a new life, a new household, perhaps even a future of influence and comfort. The groom would carry forward his family's wealth, ensured by the very system that chained her. For them, the feast was a symbol of continuity, a ritual of abundance. For her, it was another reminder of her place at the bottom of it all, working unseen while others toasted to their freedom and happiness. The kitchen fires crackled as she moved from dish to dish, her mind not on the recipes but on the bitterness that had been simmering inside her for years. Every sound from the parlor, the laughter, the music, the clinking glasses, pushed her deeper into her thoughts. She was surrounded by life, yet excluded from it. She was the architect of the very joy she would never taste. This sense of invisibility was not unique to her alone. It was the condition of every enslaved person in America, forced to serve while being denied even the simplest recognition of their humanity. Yet in her case, the weight of that silence transformed into something sharper. She carried in her hands the ability to sustain life or to end it. On that day, in that kitchen, she was no longer just a servant. She was a storm forming quietly behind the walls, unseen and unheeded, while the household prepared for its moment of triumph. Soon, the family and their guests would learn that even the shadows could strike, and that the cook they overlooked had not been powerless after all. The tables were set with care, their long white cloths smoothed to perfection, their edges trimmed with ribbons that fluttered faintly in the afternoon breeze. Crystal goblets caught the sunlight, scattering fragments of color across the polished silverware. Platters gleamed with roasted meats, golden and fragrant, their juices glistening beneath the sheen of the fire. Loaves of bread, warm and soft, released a yeasty perfume that mingled with the sharp sweetness of cakes dusted in sugar. From every angle, the feast appeared to be an offering of abundance, a promise that this marriage would be blessed with prosperity and joy. But beneath the surface of that beauty lay a secret no guest could imagine. Into the food had been stirred something far more potent than spices or sugar. The cook's hands, steady and deliberate, had slipped a hidden bitterness into the heart of the celebration. Each dish bore not only the mark of her labor but the weight of her rage, her grief, her years of voiceless endurance. To the unknowing eye, the banquet was a triumph of skill. To her, it was the vehicle of her vengeance. The guests took their places at the tables with laughter that carried across the yard. Glasses were lifted, toasts were made, and words of blessing fell like petals on the ears of the young bride and groom. Plates filled quickly, the feast consumed with the enthusiasm of people who believed they were witnessing the beginning of a blessed future. They ate with delight, savoring the richness of the meats, the sweetness of the pies, the lightness of the cakes. They tasted joy, they tasted celebration, they tasted freedom, never suspecting that every bite was laced with something meant to undo them. The cook had chosen her moment carefully. To act in silence, to hide her hand, to strike in such a way that her vengeance would fall not just upon the masters, but upon all who gathered in their name. She knew that a wedding was more than a union between two people. It was a public display of wealth, of status, of continuity. By turning the feast into a weapon, she was not merely striking at individuals, but at the very structure that bound her life in chains. Every smile at the table, every glass raised in cheer, became an act of unknowing defiance against what had been woven into their food. The cheer of the musicians, the rustle of silk gowns, the voices lifted in song, all seemed to conspire in ignorance, never sensing that the air was already thick with a darker fate. The poison worked invisibly, as silent as the woman who had prepared it, waiting only for its moment to reveal itself. In that instant, the balance of power shifted. The masters and their guests, so certain of their control, so oblivious to the humanity of the woman in the kitchen, had placed their lives directly into her hands. And as the feast continued, each mouthful carried them closer to a reckoning that would turn their day of joy into one of unforgettable horror. At first, the shift was subtle. A guest set down his fork and pressed a hand against his stomach, attributing the sudden discomfort to overeating. Another dabbed at her lips with a napkin, her complexion paling as she tried to smile through the unease. Laughter still floated over the tables, but it began to sound brittle, as though shadows had slipped into the light-hearted air. The fiddler's tune carried on, but fewer feet tapped to its rhythm. A silence began to creep in between bursts of conversation, a silence heavy with something no one could yet name. Then the murmurs began. A cough at one table, a groan at another. Chairs scraped against the ground as guests shifted, glancing uneasily at one another. The symptoms spread like ripples in water. An uncle clutching his throat, a bridesmaid swaying on her feet, a child collapsing into his mother's arms. The joyous chaos of a wedding feast was dissolving into a different kind of chaos altogether, one steeped in fear. Plates that had been polished clean only moments before were abandoned. Cups of wine tipped and spilled across the linen, staining it crimson. Silverware clattered to the ground as hands trembled uncontrollably. The scent of roasted meat and sugared cakes now mingled with the acrid tang of sweat, bile, and panic. What had been a scene of celebration transformed almost in an instant into one of collective suffering. The bride's smile, once radiant beneath her veil, faltered as she gripped the table for balance. The groom, flushed with both pride and wine earlier, now doubled over, his face contorted with pain. The sounds of festivity gave way to moans, gasps, and the cries of frightened children. Every guest seemed touched by the same invisible hand, seized by a force they could neither see nor understand. Confusion reigned. Some whispered of spoiled food, others of divine punishment, as the afflicted fell one by one. Servants rushed in with basins of water and cloths, but their efforts were powerless against the poison already coursing through veins. Mothers fanned their children with desperate hands, while fathers demanded explanations no one could give. Fear magnified with every collapse, every pale face, every voice raised in agony. The wedding yard, so carefully prepared for joy, became an open-air chamber of misery. No one was spared from the growing dread, not even those who still stood, watching the suffering of others with horror written across their faces. The music ceased altogether as the fiddler lowered his bow, his eyes wide at the spectacle before him. Where there had been applause and cheer, there was now only the sound of retching, crying, and prayers uttered in trembling whispers. What had begun as a feast to bless a marriage became a reckoning. Guests who had entered the day with laughter and expectation now found themselves bound together in a shared nightmare. Every bite they had taken, every sip they had swallowed, had carried with it the seed of their undoing. And in that moment, the fragile illusion of safety that surrounded their lives shattered completely, leaving only fear and the realization that someone among them had orchestrated this downfall. Panic settled over the household like a storm cloud that refused to move. Guests who could still stand stumbled through the yard in search of help, their steps unsteady, their voices hoarse with fear. Physicians were summoned with urgency, arriving with their leather bags and grim expressions, but their knowledge could do little more than name what was already clear. Something had entered the bodies of the celebrants, something deliberate, something far deadlier than spoiled food or indigestion. As the afflicted writhed and moaned, the questions turned sharper, more frantic. Whispers coiled through the gathering like smoke. Who had prepared the feast? Who had touched every dish, every pot, every glass? Eyes shifted toward the kitchen, toward the one figure who had moved invisibly through the celebration. The cook, the enslaved woman who had been the architect of the meal, suddenly became the center of every suspicion. The household servants were questioned first, their words spilling out in fear. They had seen her in the kitchen from dawn until dusk, alone with the spices, the pots, the ingredients. No one else had handled the food with such intimacy. The evidence to the frightened crowd seemed to point in only one direction. Rumor transformed quickly into certainty. A quiet murmur of "the cook" grew louder until it became a collective cry. Her presence, once overlooked, now loomed with unbearable weight. People spoke of her silence, of the way she kept her head bowed, of the years she had endured in that house with little more than obedience expected of her. In the haze of fear, those memories twisted into signs of menace. Perhaps her silence had been more than humility. Perhaps it had been a mask for something darker. Speculation turned quickly to motive. Some declared it must have been rebellion, an act born of hatred toward those who claimed ownership of her life. Others whispered of revenge for cruelties unspoken, injustices endured in silence for years. There were those who wondered if she had intended to poison all along, or if some private humiliation had finally tipped her into action. Each voice added to the storm of accusation, though none could claim to know her heart. The community was caught between horror and disbelief. This was not merely an act of violence, it was a violation of trust at the most intimate level. A meal was supposed to be nourishment, a bond between host and guest, a symbol of celebration. To turn it into a weapon was to strike at the very core of human fellowship. And yet, in the eyes of many, such an act could only come from one who had lived so long on the margins, one who had been forced to labor, unseen, unthanked, unfree. The secret had been revealed not by her confession, but by the unrelenting logic of suspicion. She had been the only one with the power to turn food into death, the only one whose position gave her both access and invisibility. And so the verdict formed before any trial began. The joyous wedding, shattered by agony, now bore another truth. The cook had risen from the shadows, not with words, but with a weapon hidden in the very dishes she served. The courtroom was heavy with silence, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the scrape of boots against wooden floors. Outside, the streets of Ohio buzzed with speculation, the story of the poisoned wedding spreading like wildfire through town squares and taverns. Inside, all attention was fixed on the figure who stood accused. The enslaved cook, once invisible in the household, now faced a sea of eyes that regarded her not as a servant but as a criminal whose actions demanded judgment. Her appearance at the trial was marked by chains, an unmistakable reminder of her position in society. She was not a citizen standing before the court with rights to defend herself. She was property brought forward as evidence of her own crime. To those who watched, her silence seemed both defiance and resignation. No outburst, no plea, only the quiet bearing of someone who had lived her life in submission and now bore its final weight. The proceedings unfolded with a grim inevitability. Witnesses stepped forward to describe the events of the wedding, their voices tinged with the shock of betrayal. They spoke of the guests collapsing, the cries of children, the chaos that had turned a joyous feast into a night of suffering. Again and again, their testimony circled back to the same conclusion. The food had been poisoned, and she alone had held the power to deliver it. The doctors added their voices, describing the symptoms in clinical tones that only heightened the dread. Stomachs burned, bodies convulsed, faces grew pale as the poison worked its way through the blood. They had seen death in slow motion and could only name the source as deliberate. It was not chance, not carelessness, but intent. Yet beneath the legal arguments, the trial carried another unspoken weight. It was not simply about whether she had committed the act, it was about the deeper threat her actions represented. For a woman in bondage to strike so boldly against her masters shattered the fragile illusion that order could be maintained through chains and obedience. If one cook could rebel with poison, then who else among the enslaved might one day rise against the system itself? Fear rippled through the community, and that fear seeped into every word spoken within the courtroom. Her defense was minimal, more ritual than reality. She had no voice in her own fate, and those who might have spoken for her lacked either the courage or the power to sway the tide. In the eyes of the law, she was guilty long before the verdict was spoken. The trial became less about uncovering truth and more about reaffirming control, restoring a sense of order to a society unsettled by her act of defiance. When judgment finally came, it carried the weight of both justice and vengeance. She was condemned not only for the poison in the food, but for the audacity of daring to use it. Our body might remain bound, but her act had already escaped beyond the courtroom walls, etched into memory as proof that even those silenced by slavery could find a way to strike back. Long after the tables had been cleared and the house had returned to its silence, the story of the poisoned wedding lingered like smoke in the air. It passed from household to household, told in whispers first, then in shouts, until it became part of the fabric of local memory. The event was no longer just a tragedy of a family brought low on a day meant for joy. It became a cautionary tale, a symbol and a wound that refused to close. For the guests who survived, the memory never softened. The taste of the food they had once praised turned bitter in recollection. Every bite had carried betrayal, every sip a hidden threat. Some avoided large gatherings afterward, haunted by the thought that celebration could conceal danger. The wedding, meant to represent unity and renewal, had left behind only suspicion and unease. For the community, the act was far more than an isolated crime. It revealed, with brutal clarity, the tension that lived just beneath the surface of a society that thrived on human bondage. Enslaved people had been treated as shadows, silent laborers who worked without resistance, but this single act shattered that illusion. The cook had shown that silence could mask fury and service could hide rebellion. Her defiance, though punished, could not be erased. It became a reminder that those bound in chains still carried within them the capacity to strike, to resist, and to reclaim some measure of control, even in the smallest or most devastating of ways. Her name, lost to history, remained absent from the records, yet her deed lived on in the stories retold by both fear and awe. To some, she was a monster who had desecrated the sacred trust of a shared meal. To others, she became an unspoken figure of resistance, a woman who had found power in the only form available to her. The absence of her voice meant no one could truly know her intentions, but the act itself spoke loudly enough. The poisoned wedding was remembered not only for its immediate horror, but for the questions it forced people to confront. How many others lived in silence, waiting for a moment to rise? How many acts of quiet defiance had been missed, overlooked, or forgotten? In a nation teetering between freedom and slavery, the story of one cook's vengeance became part of a larger conversation, a foreshadowing of the unrest and conflict that lay ahead. In the end, her legacy was not the trial or the punishment, but the echo of her choice. She had taken the tools of her servitude, pots, pans, herbs, and recipes, and turned them into weapons. She had transformed a day of joy into a lesson carved deep into memory, that even those forced into silence could, for one brief, burning moment, make themselves heard. The wedding was meant to seal a union. Instead, it became a fracture that revealed the cracks in an entire society, and though her name was forgotten, her act ensured she would never truly vanish from history's gaze.